for you. Thank you for trusting us. Passing to Fede.
Muchas gracias, Aubrey. And thank you, everybody, for that shared altar. I'm so honored to be here with all of you. And yeah, this is a very special story because it has to do a lot with personal story, but also ancient story. And the case study of Yo Prefiero el Lago is kind of the first hack that where we actually tested the methodology of culture hack. And this girl that appears in the picture now has 8 more years, so I'm sure that she is now a full land defender. But the important thing to tell about this story is that this happened in what we know today as Mexico City. But before colonial times, this was actually a interconnected ecosystem of lakes that then, during the process of colonization and through today's story, was desiccated, right? So it was this big story of human versus nature, but not only human, just colonial versus nature, right? And what still today exists about the ancient lake of Texcoco is where this story started to happen, right? And this story is just, like a small part of the story of a longer struggle. So we are not attributing this win because of culture hack, but because we were able to work together with a very old organization that was already happening in the land. And I'm not going to go too much into depth. You can watch the documentary if you have some time. But the idea is that this fight against a mega project or a mega airport that the government wanted to build on top of an ancient lake started in 2001. And then there were different moments of this struggle, like big moments of violence against the communities, some wins. But at the time that we entered this fight, it was a moment of a consultation. So a new government, a progressive government, had just won Mexico's presidency. And one of the first things that they did was actually asking, do people actually want an airport on top of a lake, or they want an airport somewhere else, right? So that's where basically the culture hack starts. And what we started to do was actually just working with the communities inside this process. But something that is important to state as part of where the culture hack comes from is that also knowing this long story of wins, but also back and forwards, like we say that change is always possible, right? But it's not permanent. Like this fight for life has been happening at least for 500 years in this territory. And an important thing that we want to show you now is like this idea that narratives can shift from different spaces, either support systems of oppression, like the hegemonic narrative at that time, which was the airport is growth, or it can support regenerative systems like defending the land as the communities were doing. And this struggle between the narratives moving and shifting is what we actually call, like culture hacking. So 2 months before the consultation, we started to work with the communities, and there was this big first poll that said that 54 people actually wanted to the mega project, right? And only 29% didn't want the mega airport. So it all started with this consultation. And basically the questions that the new government stated was, do you want an airport here or do you want an airport there, right? So it wasn't about choosing a different option, but just choosing where do you want this kind of development. And what we found is that, like there was this fight between different worldviews, which was the airport, which is progress and development, the communities that were saying yes to the land, no to the plains, and then the new government, which was, like not actually saying you can choose either to have an airport or not to have an airport. It's you have to choose an airport, just you want to choose where, right? So that's why we put that in the status quo space. So what we started to do at the beginning of the hack was actually to co-create a point of view with the communities and the organizations that were working there. So we start with this process of internal consultation and with the question of how can we hear the voice of the territory? How can the communities tell their own stories? And how can we open a third option in the consultation that is not there, right? But to open a narrative uh, third option. And then we did like a very beautiful exercise that was called the letter of the lake. If you watch the documentary, you will listen to the letter of the lake. But basically, it was telling the story of the voice of the lake through the people who lived there. So this is an extract. In this land, in rainy season, I keep fighting. Here you can see me. I am the past story, the present, and the future. And what we came after this internal consultation was a simple statement, right? Which is the point of view. And that's kind of the part that we are learning today. And it says, we are a coalition of 22 organizations plus the peoples of the lake. We see that the voices of the communities are not heard. Therefore, we want to hack the airport conversation. To achieve this, we must reveal that the lake is more important than economic growth. So as you can see, this is a very simple but clear statement of what we want and who we are. And that's kind of what we're learning today. And we will tell a little bit more the story of this. But at the same time, and this is where we want you to see the full overall overarch of a hack, after having this statement and point of view, what we started to do was listening to the conversation. And the easiest way to listen to the conversation at that time, listen, it was almost 10 years ago. It was through social media, right? So we had access to listening through the Twitter API. And what we started to look was a conversation that was centralized by the new government followers and the proposal of the consultation. That was what was being told at that time. And that was the hegemonic narrative. And we started also to listen to the communities, to the resistances, and they were barely existent in the conversation, and they were kind of disorganized, right? So Atenco, which is the main community that lives there at the airport site, mentions were barely present, and that's how we started this process. We also did some small listening, so you will learn this along the different sessions, but basically, we basically read all the news, all the days to spot the different news that there were around this airport consultation, and we started to see patterns in this small listening. And what came after listening to social media and listening to media was to create this map where different narrative communities start to pop up, right? So you can see we have this justice axis, and you will also learn about this later. And we have the knowledge axis, and then we can map the different communities that appear. But the airport development community was very reinforcing the system, and it was very, like Western way of thinking, while the communities were very small and they were in this regenerative systems narrative, and they had like this plurality of knowledge because they are indigenous and non-indigenous communities living around the lake. And that's where we started to craft a strategy. We knew that, like going full into this amazing and radical thinking of the communities would leave that narrative just isolated from this general conversation. So what we needed to find was this common ground between the big conversation and what the communities were saying. And that's where these alternative systems of knowing and being, like start to emerge. And that's where we got this frame or this meme that is, I prefer the lake, right? When they ask a consultation about airports, we prefer the lake. And that's how it all started to become, like a coalition of movements pushing towards a common narrative. And it came from organizing, that are all these communities that were fighting for many years, to narratives, to building a strategy that can push towards a very specific framing in a very specific movement. But also, like, narratives became organizing, right? Once Yo Prefiero el Lago started to become a big campaign and a shared narrative, then it started to just grow and grow and grow. And what started to happen is that people started to organize through that narrative and through that framing. And what we saw 3 weeks after we started this communication process was that the voice of the lake and the communities grew in just a few weeks prior to the consultation, and it just decentralized, right? And this is, this is a visualization for those who haven't seen this. Like, each dot is a tweet, and then it's just like a mesh of communications that were and interconnections that were happening through a very specific narrative. But the important thing to say about this is that, like, from this movement narrative, it started to go into mainstream, right? So media before that communication hack, they were talking about growth and about economy. And during this process, they started to talk about ecocide. And almost all the main media, like, took the narrative and started to spread it out there. And this is a graph of the day of the consultation, where you will see on top there is Santa Lucia, which was the second option for the airport, Texcoco, which was the first option of the airport, and there was a third option, which was I prefer the lake. So even though that didn't happen in paper in the consultation, like, the public sphere and the public communication started to move towards a more life-centric narrative. And that's kind of what we want for you to understand, like, what we understand as culture hacking, right? Like, from this perspective of growth and economic, to a life-centered conversation that was actually mainstream and started to emerge from this conversation. And the important thing, it's not only like what happens that day. That day, the airport in Texcoco was canceled, but also other struggles around Mexico start to take this meme as something that makes sense for their own struggles, right? So we didn't have to do anything with all of this, but some other movements start to emerge. In Santa Lucia, the new place of the airport, I prefer the mountains. In Chiapas, I prefer the jungle. In Morelos, I prefer life. So these memes started to spread, right? And that's also what we call, like, this capacity, like this memetic capacity that have the culture hack. But the most important thing, again, is how those narratives become a soil, become a common ground, and become territory again, right? And again, this is not because a campaign, this is because of an organized struggle, but an organized struggle that at some point creates a coherence around narrative. So after 22 years, in 2023, Atenco rematriated the land and negotiated an ecological reserve, the ancient Lake of Texcoco, which is 41 times Central Park, which is very big. And I think that the important lesson to learn here, again, is how can narratives become organizing become, like, changes in the relationships between the people and the land, right? And again, we are going to go into the specifics on how to build a point of view, but what we want you to take from this presentation is that stating very clearly from the beginning who you are, what are your intentions, and what do you want to achieve is very important, because during the whole process of your hack, you will have different options. And this, like the point of view, will be your compass, will be your guide during the whole hack process. And we ask some very specific and general questions sometimes, but the idea is that we manage to answer them, so we can answer with very specifically the statement of the point of view. I'm not going to read this, but they are going to stay there if you want to come back to the presentation. But we are going to go into the theory of this in a brief moment. So thank you very much. I wanted to share this also just to acknowledge that these communities still fight for their ecosystem. They are still rebuilding what the starting of the constructions started there to destroy the ecocide that happened. And also today is a very important moment in Mexico City, because the World Cup is starting, but also so many movements are just rising today because there's still so much work to do. And I'm passing this to Tiffany.
Thank you so much, Philly. And it's great to see you all again. Thank you for coming. It's really a privilege to be in this container with you. And it's a lot of information. I know there are some comments in the chats about will we share the presentations, and they will be recorded so you can go over the content again. And just to note, we will be going over the case studies and the method again and again. So you'll really start to understand and have these aha moments over the next 8 months. So really don't worry if you're feeling a little lost or overwhelmed by the information at this stage. And I'm going to talk to you about the first step in the culture hack method, which we call ask. And here we really start our journey. So we create what we call a point of view, which sets the scene. So you're all on the same page and you can really design the research and design the project that you're going to implement. So a point of view is really about co-creating with your team and collectively asking the correct questions. It's kind of like a manifesto that outlines the context and intention of the narrative-led systems change intervention that you want to use and hack. So it's kind of like a compass, like Fede said, that really guides us, that we can always return to. I know some people in my advisor group last year, they had just written their point of view on a post-it note, and they always had it on their laptop whenever they were working on this project. So they could always have this kind of guiding star there. And if you go on to the next slide, here in a little bit more detail, you can see that what we really want to do is set ourselves up for then moving into the research phase, where we start listening to the narrative space, which will inform how we analyze and how we create the reframes in our interventions. And there's a few questions on the next slide you'll see that we want to just get your kind of narrative-led systems change hat on and reflect on personally and in your team. The fact that narrative-led systems change is really long-term work. This is really about the interplay between narrative change and community organizing, community building, and back to narrative change, like Fede was saying with the Yo prefiero el lago example. So you want to really think about what you want to achieve, not only in the short and medium term, but also long, long, long term. So think about the next 6 months, think about how your hack will contribute to change in the next couple of years. On the next slide, you'll even see we want you to think big, like what do you want to achieve in the next 5 to 10 years? And on the next slides as well, you'll see that we want you to really be thinking about what kind of socioeconomic system we want to usher in, what we want to promote, and also how we can measure narrative impact? Like, what does success or impact look like to you and your team and your community in which you're embedded? So what I'll do is talk you through those questions that Fede had up a little bit in more detail. And essentially, we have the point of view, the ingredients, as you might call it. There are four questions. It's the who, the why, the what, and the how of your project. So the first is, who are you? And this is really about defining who's on your team, the project team, the group, and the groups of stakeholders that this project matters to. And therefore, it's helpful to ask the following questions. Who are the people who are working on the project and what are their skills, capacities? And be sure to add the geographic location and the demographics. This also is important to have consideration of positionality, and also ask who are the stakeholders for your project? In what ways will your project impact these stakeholders? And then on to the second question, it's what is the motivation for this project? So this is really the why. So this is really listing the most important insights into why this project is important to you as a collective. So it's best to define maybe key facts or insights that drive your desire to change the narrative. So this is really a kind of diagnostic question where you really describe the issues at stake. And you're situating your work here in the broader kind of ideological systems or socioeconomic systems that you're seeing, that you're a part of. And so here, of course, you answer the question, what is the motivation for the project and why does it matter? And what important facts determine the scope of the hack? And then the third question, we're moving on to the what. So this is really a focus on the outcomes, articulating the outcomes you wish to obtain through this narrative hack. In other words, what do you want to achieve? What do you want to see shift? And how might this narrative-led systems change unfold? So here we can really start thinking about the success metrics and impact metrics. And in Culture Hack, we think about these through the lens of social tipping points, which we'll talk about more as the weeks go on. But just a little footnote there is social tipping points are a concept in sociology where a small committed group of people, usually 10 to 25% of a population, can really influence social norms and really contribute to this tipping point and narrative-led systems change. So that's number 3. That's the what was it? The what of the POV, and then we move to the how. So this is the final question. How will your movement create the change that you desire? So this is really about the practical steps that are taken in this specific narrative intervention to get there. So now you're kind of, after casting your mental net out wide and thinking of all of the kind of bigger picture context of this intervention, you're now going to hone in and start thinking about what do you really need to do to achieve your goal. So the questions here are, what needs to be done to achieve the desired outcome, and of course, how to represent the different voices in the room. And then on the next slide, I can just show you here, it's a summary. So often point of views, like Fede showed in the Mexico example, you kind of have a little summary that says, we are ... We see that, the why. Therefore, we want to, the bigger picture of what you want to change. And to achieve this, we must, and that this is the kind of little step-by-step how of how you achieve the what. So we have a worksheet for you that we will be sending out after this session. So we will give you plenty of support and instruction. So we'll get back to this later. And we just want to show you a couple of examples. I won't go into them in detail, but again, you can click on the links on the next slides if you go over this presentation again. One is it's an example of the different variations of point of views. Some are more poetic, some are more political statement oriented, some are more technical. So you really can play around. You don't have to stick to the format we're giving you, but if you want to also do a more poetic or statement version, you absolutely can. And so the letter of the lake, Fede mentioned, this is a beautiful poetic point of view that really sees the lake as a being and what the lake says. And so you can browse through that in your time. And on the next slide, you'll see a manifesto in one of the Brazilian contexts of culture hack. And this is a more political manifesto. So this is also a brilliant example to skim through and see how other social movements and community organizing contexts have connected to narrative-led systems change methodologies. Amazing. I think that's it for the introduction to the nitty-gritty